Hi, everybody, and welcome to this Devex event with Patricia Espinosa, who has just left her position as Executive Secretary of the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change, the UNFCCC, a job you got in 2016, Patricia, and you have been in charge of a pretty important, overseeing a pretty important and, some would say increasingly desperate time for climate diplomacy since then. So thank you so much for joining us. We really appreciate it.
Thank you. Thank you very much for this opportunity again with Devex, to be able to share some insights now in my role as a global citizen, trying to continue to make a contribution to addressing climate change. Thank you. Thank you.
Well, we really appreciate your time, and you've been very much at the nexus of everything over the last few years. I'm going to start by talking a bit about something close to home for me. In the UK this week, we've had the hottest ever days recorded in our history. We've also seen wildfires throughout Europe, and obviously there's even far more dramatic extreme climate events taking us all around the world and further afield. But do you think these extreme events coming closer to home, more unusual things happening, will that make a difference to how politicians, particularly from some of the global north countries, think and behave around climate and climate diplomacy?
William, I certainly hope so. I really hope that politicians will look at this as also as an opportunity to assume a very important responsibility in taking decisions that will affect the way humanity will be living in the future. And already now, it's not only about the future. I think that regarding climate change, we've been talking a lot about what will happen in 2050 or what will happen in, by the end of the century. And yes, of course, in scientific terms, this is how science builds up their models in order to be able to assess what we can expect in the coming years. But the truth is that, and science has been telling us this for a long time, for more than 10 years, even much more than 10 years. But let's say, okay, in the last 10 years, science has really been very consistent in and growing in knowledge and expertise on what is really happening in terms of global warming. And it is really incredible that we continue to see people being surprised by these extreme weather events. We have been hearing from science that this is the reality that we will be facing, and we will be facing it more frequently and in more severe ways. We don't know exactly when it will happen and where it will happen. That's the question, but not whether it will happen. And the fact that this is not only about the weather is okay, but it's about what it creates for we, the humans. So many people have passed in the last weeks because of the fires, and then also in contrast because of the floods in the Sahel. Just now they are being affected by floods. Sahel, a region that has been suffering from drought for so long. So, I really certainly hope that this is going to be a wake-up call for all decision makers, politicians, but also decision makers in other areas of our societies.
I mean, one of the most scary aspects for me, at least, of climate change is this concept of tipping points, which I'm sure you're familiar with. I mean, how do you think we can reach a kind of a political tipping point, or have we already kind of reached that and it just hasn't kind of filtered down enough into people's sort of awareness yet?
Yes, well, we have already reached these tipping points in many areas. If we look at the losses that the species that have been eliminated from the face of the earth and that we will not be able to see again, that's a very clear indication of this. And we also see, for example, out of the effects of these extreme weather events, losses that are impossible to recover, starting with human lives. You know, that's for me is always. I mean, having had the privilege of being a decision maker or somebody that can influence decision making, I do feel there's a very big responsibility for those lives that are lost, for those cases where people are left without anything, that they need to start all over again. And you know, it's in the developed world, well, maybe there are some mechanisms that may support them. In the developing world, that's normally not the case. And beyond that, the trauma that these people experience from that situation. Just here, just in Germany, close to the place where the UNFCCC has its headquarters, there were these floods, and people tell they are still not being able to overcome this trauma.
There's an awful lot to kind of unpack in that answer, and I mean, loss and damage has been, I mean, a fairly contentious issue in the climate space for a while. Trauma, that I don't know if that's even started to come up in kind of as an agenda item. But again, that's something that people struggle to get into around conflict and peacemaking as well. It's a huge important there. I guess because I haven't heard, you know, trauma mentioned so much in a kind of a climate diplomacy space. Loss and damage, we all sort of kind of are aware now of the impact that has on trust and the kind of the related issues that of how that feeds into the broader climate diplomacy piece. But trauma and other psychological kind of effects of climate change as well. Do you think that those factors are, you know, truly appreciated by the people working to negotiate for solutions to this, and the people you know, who hold the power?
Well, you know, I think not all of these issues are addressed. Let's say the question of the psychological consequences of climate change. Now I refer to the trauma that people experience when they lose everything, they have to flee from their houses. The people that we have seen, right, they are evacuated because the fire is catching their house. I mean, just imagining that situation is so scary. It's also very worrying to me, the fact that young people are increasingly anxious and very, you know, very much afraid about their future and what is happening, and feel very confused on how to react and what to do. That is something that also needs to be addressed. Maybe not within the UNFCCC. There is, for example, the World Health Organization, where they are now putting emphasis on climate change and health, but they are, for the time being, as far as I know, more focused on, for example, respiratory problems or problems derived from malnutrition, because it's the food crisis is, of course, very much linked to the climate change. But this part of the mental health really needs to be addressed. And in our process, of course, there are not the there is not the expertise to address this. And so we need to find the spaces. We need to build the spaces if they are not there yet. On other issues, I would say, and having been a negotiator or also part of my life, it's sometimes difficult. You are tasked with making the negotiation on a specific issue. And it is very easy to lose sight of the overall picture, you know, and where that specific issue that you are negotiating fits. So it is very important that we can keep a high-level conversation that integrates all the different issues and that gives them a clear perspective of why each one of those individual pieces are so important.
What do you think would be the appropriate forum for doing that? Is it
well, look, we do have some opportunities where ministers meet and they have a dialogue. Just now, the Petersberg dialogue was held in Berlin this week. At the beginning of this week, I did not have an opportunity to follow it closely because I had other engagements here in Mexico at home. But there are opportunities, and I would say this is what we need to do. Now, the guidance from this higher level political conversation to the negotiators, that is also a step that is very important, and it is frequently not there. The negotiators, not all of them have access to the ministers. They don't normally or not frequently get the direct input on, you know, what is it that you need to change in your positioning regarding this negotiation. So I think this is what we really need to see. We need to have this high-level conversation, but then have that high-level conversation reflected in the negotiations. One very clear example, in Glasgow, we had over 120 heads of state and government, right. And all of them were talking about the need for more finance for developing countries. And that was, of course, the case of the heads of state and government from developing countries. But the developed countries leaders were also saying and recognizing that there had been a failure in delivering the 100 billion, etc., and the need to accelerate this. What we have seen so far, and of course, at that time, we didn't know that we would have a war in Ukraine, but what has happened since then does not reflect in terms of finance, does not reflect what was expressed by leaders at that moment.
Although we are still kind of we haven't met the 100 billion target. But before I kind of go into asking about that, do you think, you've said in previous interviews, you think COP26 was generally speaking, a success and the most progressive climate conference that's been since Paris? Feel free to correct me on that. Just on what you were saying about the high-level political leaders being there alongside the negotiators, and you know them having the kind of the mandate to impart this, you know, the psychological dynamics that you were talking about, and the motivation to kind of drive negotiations forward. Do you think the presence of those two groups kind of together, perhaps more so than other conferences, made a difference to the outcome of COP26?
I think so. I really do think so. I think it set the tone. You know, it was, in my view, the first time that we saw from so many leaders a very clear recognition that they had failed, that their countries had failed to deliver on the promise of the support for developing countries, completely the 100 billion. But we all know it goes beyond the 100 billion. It's not only the 100 billion, it's And in many cases, it's really about, for example, one of the discussions that take place very frequently is about capacity building and the capacity building needs of developing countries. And when the negotiations are going on in the, Paris Committee on Capacity Building, when it comes to the question of resources for capacity building, there's always a bigger problem, right? Everybody can agree that there are needs and that they need to be addressed, but then, okay, who will provide the support for that, the financial support or the resources for that? That becomes a problem. So it is really a question that goes across all the different aspects of the work of a climate change process. Yeah, I really think this needs to be corrected.
And it's interesting that you mentioned capacity building as well. I think that is probably something that feeds into the broader development space as well, and issues like good governance and more resilient societies. So there's certainly a role for a lot of different organizations and people there. So you mentioned Ukraine just then, and since COP26, well, we're still feeling COP26 happened during COVID, as those of us who've been doing tests every day well remember. Since then, we've had Ukraine. We're still feeling the financial effects of COVID. And since then, of course, we've had the invasion of Ukraine by Russia, which has caused a food crisis and an energy crisis as well. I'd be really interested to get your thoughts in how, and this is causing cascading crises and intersecting crises, which has been, some really worrying kind of dynamics at play. I'd be keen to kind of get your read on how that might affect climate negotiations and climate action more broadly, please.
Well, this is definitely one of the most difficult scenarios that we have seen for decades. It's probably the most complex scenario that we have seen in decades. And, we do have, of course, the war in Ukraine, unfortunately. But we have lots of other armed conflicts and violent conflicts in different parts of the world. Look at Africa, how many countries are experiencing violent conflicts. It's really terrible. So yes, this conference will be taking place in this very unfortunate situation. However, I think that we should use the conference as an opportunity to say, look, regardless of all of those crises, the climate change emergency remains the biggest threat to humanity. And in that regard, we cannot have the luxury of postponing any kind of action. And we need to have everybody on board, because climate change does not recognize any borders. So we need everybody on board. It is a good signal that today the Paris Agreement and the Convention are two of the most universal international instruments. With the addition of the Vatican, now we have 198 parties. So it's really a scenario where we need to come together again and say, look, on this, we just need to stand together.
I just know already that the people will hear that, and some people are going to say that, how can a nation like, for instance, Russia, which has not only caused a large proportion of these, has a large responsibility for the way that some of these crises have played out. Some people are going to be asking, how can they be involved in this process, this really fiendish kind of process where you have to get so many different parties to agree to something. I mean, how would you respond to that?
Well, I would say that, we don't have any legal mechanism that would allow us to say, look, we are going to exclude this or that country. And regarding climate change, the nature of this existential threat to humanity, I think, is the key to understanding that it is not possible to pretend that we are going to address effectively the climate crisis if we do not allow everybody to participate. And I mean, we know there are so many different views in the international community in terms of economic policies, in terms of political practices, in terms of human rights situations, in terms of, but I really believe this is an area where we just need to work together.
Okay. It's a bit of a heavy going conversation, so maybe we could turn to some things you're more optimistic about. Where do you have most cause for hope?
Well, on the one side, I do feel, again, for example, this addition by the Vatican, to me, what was a very, very important signal by itself, but also because I interpreted it as a signal that the Paris Agreement and the convention, the whole process of intergovernmental process on climate change has this credibility. I mean, it is a strong piece of the international multilateral system. So I think that's one point, and yes, it's not perfect, and we have different kinds of situations with the member states, but it is there, and it has been able to drive and say exactly what are the goals that the world needs to achieve. On the other hand, a lot of innovation and a lot of things happening also within the governments, but also beyond, in the private sector, in the financial sector. Yes, we need to do more work in terms of being able to follow up and have some more insights on the pledges that private sector is making. But the fact that it is happening, to me, indicates there is a clear recognition that this is the way to go, that this is not, it's not only the right thing to do, but it's also the thing that has to be done for their own interests. So I think there is really a lot of developments happening. I hope also that civil society, which has played a very important role, remains very engaged, especially now with these situations that have been affecting so many countries, in demanding to their decision makers the right approach. We need to have a very, very serious conversation about transitions, energy transition, just transitions in general, so that we can be more confident that we will be able to achieve the goals of the Paris Agreement.
Fantastic. And there was, of course, some really interesting work that began on just transitions at COP26.
Yes.
So, I mean, is that the key area that you're going to be looking out for coming out of next year's negotiations? This year's negotiations, excuse me.
This year's, yes. Well, I think, again, like in every conference, the negotiation needs to be able to put together a good package that is balanced between the different areas. Mitigation, adaptation, loss and damage, finance, capacity building, technology, but then achieving that balance within that package that must be guided by the common objective of addressing this existential threat for humanity would also need to be accompanied by, again, lots of clear indications by other stakeholders like private sector, financial sector, all of them, that they are going on the same direction.
Okay, so when you look back over your tenure at the UNFCCC, is there anything that you wish you had done slightly differently?
Well, yes, I am a person that is very. I believe that you need to be self-critical, and you need also to be able to take on any feedback, even if it's not, to tell you, oh, you were great. And I think there is always room for improvement in any process, in any institution. But overall, I feel satisfied. Of course, if you would ask me what would be the area where you would have liked to get more better results, well, of course, getting us closer to the 1.5 degree goal, to the reduction that we need to achieve by 2030, would have been wonderful. Yeah, my work in addressing this with all the different leaders in the world was, very satisfying. Everybody listening and recognizing the importance of that. But the fact remains, unfortunately, that we are still not there. So I continue to call on them.
So what have you learned during that time, and what advice would you hand over to your successor, whoever that person turns out to be?
Well, in that regard, I have said that very broad advice is don't give up. Don't ever give up. It's not something that we can do. It's a big responsibility. And as the person in charge with that, you cannot have that luxury. On the other hand, yeah, I would say that it's this moment where we need to be able to accelerate implementation. We should be able to be working more closely individually with the countries. It's very hard because, of course, the Secretariat is a small institution, and if you take the dimension of the challenge, it's very, very small. But I do believe that the Secretariat has the capacity to be helpful to countries in their implementation efforts.
Do you think the Secretariat should be expanded?
I don't think we need to have a huge Secretariat. I do think we need, the Secretariat needs to be strengthened, and it needs to get some more support. However, I think what is important also is that we manage to work more effectively with other institutions from the UN system and beyond the UN system. Because it's not about centralizing all the action. That's not it doesn't make sense. And as climate change is really a cross-cutting issue in all different areas of society, then what is important is that we get everybody to work applying the lens of climate change.
And with that in mind, do you have any sort of recommendations for the broader multilateral system for how that can be done, that improves the coordination? What would you sort of really like to see there?
Well, I have to say the Secretary General, the Deputy Secretary General, they have been making some efforts. There is, for example, a group of climate principals that meets regularly with the DSG, and we discuss the different, we share our analysis, we discuss the different areas where we need to focus. But the fact that each of the UN entities get their mandates and their, their work programs approved independently makes it kind of difficult. So in a way, I would say that it is very much a question to get member states to be more focused on building this coherence throughout the different governing bodies of the different UN entities as a whole. And then, of course, as you can imagine, like in any institution, everybody looks at its institution and its own programs. I believe that coordination is probably the most difficult task, not only in the UN, because I have been in government, so I know that, and probably also in other areas. But in this case, because of the dimension of the existential threat, I think we have the responsibility to overcome, all the different traditional practices and really embark on a way of working together that is unique and puts the world together on this common purpose.
Okay. Well, I think that's a lovely place to draw the interview to a close. So thank you so much for joining us, Patricia Espinosa, and good luck with the rest of your climate journey.
Thank you, William. Thank you very much. Bye.